Yeah, so I'm keen to talk about some of the some of what we need to do, and I hope we do take this to practicalities in order to move our club to where it needs to be from the points of view of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. I am working off of a fairly basic set of notes on about 8 cards. And that means that I'm really happy to stop to provide brief answers to questions or have discussions on points that people want to discuss. I'm not working off of a script. I'm not briefing off of slides. And that gives me a certain level of flexibility. That means we can spend a certain amount of time going down rabbit holes if we like. I will introduce myself in a moment, but first, I just want to say a couple of words about leadership. The key parts of leadership that I want to bring into this are the idea that leadership is influencing. It is a way to get people to do something. And what do we want to get people to do? We want to get people to collaborate to achieve an aim. You can lead one person to collaborate with you. You can lead 10 people to collaborate with you, but by definition, I think leadership is a collaborative set of processes, and it's goal-oriented. You lead to achieve an aim. And I spent a few days at the beginning of this month doing a workshop, participating in a workshop about courageous leadership. And I came away from that very inspired, very fired up. And I've been trying to bring courageous leadership into what I'm doing this year. And I hope that there is some courageous leadership material in what we've got to talk about today. And all of us bring to leadership our orientation to leadership, our training, leadership development work we've done in the past. There are leadership styles that are comfortable to us and some that are uncomfortable, but we need to learn. And leadership is a matter of continuous development for, I think, everybody who seeks to lead. So in calling this a leadership session, I think I am putting all of us out there and demanding something fairly serious, demanding leadership from us. And I hope to get into some of the reasons why in this particular club, leadership can be difficult and can be problematical. Right, so who am I? I'm Lyonet de Covenham. I've been in the SCA for 43 years in December, so 44 years this coming winter, so a good long time. I have a background in what we used to call equal opportunities, and then called equality and diversity, and then called EDI, and now EDIB.
And now it's the Office of Inclusive Programs, I think is what we're changing it to now, here in the SCA anyway.
Yeah, and so structures are going to be important. It's a really interesting point to bring up, and we'll touch on structures as we go, because structures interact with concepts, don't they? And often they're the way that we deliver concepts. So I was Equal Opportunities Advisor to the Commandant of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, and that was a challenging and fulfilling position to have. I was an Army officer for a number of years. I did other work in government service and worked in diversity networks across UK government through a lot of my time working in UK government. And I work in a number of fields right now, mostly in leadership positions. And a lot of what I need to do as a leader is represent and influence in order to exercise diversity leadership, to create organizations that are diverse, inclusive, that are equitable to the people in the organization, And I've not yet worked out how belonging works into my leadership roles. I think that's going to be some work to do continuously. A lot of what I do is sit on boards of directors and make strategy either as a board member or as an advisor to boards. So that's my background. I'm also a queer immigrant from an ethnic minority, and that's something else which shapes a lot of my approach to a lot of this. So underlying leadership is having goals. You want to lead to goals. And also, when we create structures, when we do organizational development work, in order to ensure that our organizations have the structures they need in order to achieve what they need to achieve, we have to think about goals. And I take a strategic approach to goal understanding and goal setting. I'm a very conservative doctrinaire strategist, as you might imagine, having taught at a military academy. And strategy is, to my understanding, about ends, ways, and means. Ends, what are you trying to do? Ways, how are you going to do it? And means, what do you have at your disposal in order to do it? Often money, but often other things. And in a club like ours, people's time and energy is often one of the most important means we have to achieve our ends. And I've just popped in here after being in the session on defining and understanding DEIB with a lot of really useful definitions. And what I find really energizing about DEIB as a set of definitions is that it envisions an end state. That is, we envision in our case, a club, an organization, a society, which is diverse, which is equitable, which is inclusive, and in which the members feel a sense of belonging. All of those are things we can envision. All of those are things we can make goals. We can understand those in our own contexts and in the context of the people around us to a greater or lesser extent. So in a DEIB context, it's easy to say what the ends are. We're trying to achieve equity. We're trying to achieve diversity. And there are a lot of reasons why. When I was doing equality and diversity work in government, we emphasized the business case for diversity. Not just that we needed social license to operate, not just that we needed to represent the people we served and reflect the populations we served, but also intellectually diverse, ethnically diverse, socially diverse, economically diverse organizations think better. You get better people if you're not excluding the people who didn't go to the right university or who are from an ethnic group that looks different from other people in the room. So without going too deeply into the rationale underlying DEIB as a set of concepts, there are goals that are easy to understand and easy to work towards without needing a lot of discussion, although there are requirements, and I'll come to that in a moment. There is also a sense in which DEIB is a target. I gather that some places overseas, that is foreign countries like the US and Canada, there is a movement to treat DEI or DEIB as, by definition, a set of negative aims. And like ESG, that is ethics, social value, SESG, social justice, ethics, sustainability, and governance. It is something which some people attack because it represents the kind of change that they're not interested in seeing. And that can be awkward. And Ducky, your point about changing the name from the DEIB office to, and what was it you said that the SCA is now calling it?
Charles is changing it to the Office of Inclusive Programs.
Inclusive programs. Might for it, I'm sure this isn't why he's doing it. I don't think it's a defensive change, but that process of changing it might also make it less of a target, make it something that people view less negatively.
It's very likely he's changing it. Well, I mean, he did state that he's changing it to bring it in line with corporate, like, and not other nonprofit practices around DEIB. So like other companies and other nonprofits are doing that, but it also, because it does make it a little bit less of a target, and it makes people less defensive when they hear. Because I think that you're right. I think that people do, especially in the United States and Canada, they get the sense of like DEIB means something gets taken away from them for these other people to get equity. And so it becomes something of a target.
Yeah, I think that's right. So when we talk about aims, when we talk about how we position what we do with respect to DEIB, to understand how we make strategy around it, how we build structures around it, we have to think about ideas like that, like branding. We have to think about how we create good, actionable policy. That is what the organization says about what it needs to do and how we do it. We have to make sure people understand the aims and understand what we are trying to achieve, or we can't lead them and they can't be expected to head in the same direction of us. We have to achieve clarity around what we are doing and why. And we have to work at protecting people and limiting damage around the effects of change, the effects of failing to change, and the effects of finding ourselves in a position where we are unable to achieve the levels of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging we want to achieve. And I'll tell you why that's important. The society is good at having policy for turfing people out. That is largely a protective function. That is, if somebody is displaying inappropriate behavior, we have a set of structures, the sanctions process, which are designed to get people out the door, to stop them participating in the short term, determine whether they need to be turfed out in the long term, and either turf them out or keep them in. And there's a fairly senior person in Drachenwald, where I live, who is very keen for us to have a disciplinary policy. And a disciplinary policy is something very different. The idea in discipline is that you're seeking to shape people's behavior and change people's behavior. And there are justifications in European employment law for seeking a disciplinary policy. One reason is that in European, including UK employment law, volunteers are protected by employment law. If you don't treat a volunteer within your organization just as well as you would treat an employee within an organization, you can find yourself at an employment tribunal, and you can find yourself paying damages, and you can find yourself in a very awkward position indeed.
The same is true in the states, in certain classes, or in certain states, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. Of course, the European view of American employment law is anybody can get sacked at any time for any reason, mostly for being part of an ethnic minority. But that's just our preconception about America.
Well, in an at-will state, that's true, Lynette. But yeah, but depending on where you're at, like depending on how your state deals with volunteers and how they how equitable your particular state is, some states do protect volunteers as employees, especially if the nonprofit has incorporated as a professional business.
Interesting. And so I guess this is not unfamiliar to everyone. So what we actually do in order to achieve what we're trying to do requires us to think about how our processes and procedures work. I know that in my kingdom's kingdom law, there is a process for kicking people out. There is a process for arbitrating, but that is solving a disagreement. But there are no processes that I see in kingdom law that are useful for improving people's ability to exist in a more diverse, more equitable, more inclusive society. And I think that's something that as leaders, we have to give some thought to. I'm going to pause now for a moment, and I'm going to ask whether people have any questions to this point, because I've been on send for a few minutes now.
The chat mostly is having comments so far, whereas people are putting links in the chat about various DEI rulings in the states and how the perception of labor laws in the U.S. is the Canada has the same perception of U.S. labor laws as Europe. But even in Canada, where the labor laws can vary from province to province up there, so volunteers are protected differently in various provinces. That's what's going on in the chat so far.
Oh. Does anybody want to unmute and ask a question? Ducky is able to moderate this. You can put up the yellow hand.
Yeah.
Goranducht.
Oh my God, who said my name right? Awesome. Merci. So I'm thinking, and probably I'm going to do a kind of we're calling it diversity dialogue and donuts for Angels Melee here in Caid, because we had a Middle Eastern persona brunch at Great Western War, and it was a wonderful kind of experience where, one, we felt validated, and we just had a relaxing atmosphere of having refreshments and being able to speak and knowing that we are in a safe place. So I wanted to create something similar for people to be able to talk, because the online discussions suck as far as I'm concerned, because you're not able to see the person's facial expressions or their tone of voice. So you can see the words and then you're like, this person is insulting me, and they're not really. So I wanted it to create this relaxed kind of atmosphere to be able to speak and not lose allies, hopefully. And so are there any suggestions people can give me of how to go about doing this? And also, I will probably end up with people who are just going to go in there to use us as targets, and how to properly deal with these kind of people. Thank you.
Ole.
There is some infrastructure in Caid. I don't mean to cut you off, Lynette, but there is some infrastructure in Caid for making these intentional spaces. I encourage you to reach out to Rosie Blackroon here in Caid, because she has the framework for making these intentional spaces where we are all there to talk about and learn about DEIB. And when somebody presents these ways of like where they're intentionally making somebody a target, she already has systems in place to deal with those people, to be like, okay, if you're going to be antagonistic and you're not going to use your listening ears, she basically does gentle parenting with them. Where it's like, if you're not going to use your listening ears, you're going to be moved over here, because other people need to be able to speak and get their point across, and other people need to be able to understand. Whereas if you're just going to be antagonistic and have a tantrum right now, you are not allowed in this space.
Golly. I have to say, the idea of painting it, Goranducht, what I got from you was the idea that you feel that by exercising leadership in this area, you're painting a target on your own back. and that what one would not expect to have to be a courageous exercise of leadership needs to be a courageous exercise of leadership.
I need to
Am I
add
right?
that I'm in real life and in the SCA, I'm an Armenian from the Middle East, and I've been a target in real life, as well as people in the SCA have used me as a target when the Middle Eastern issue has become more up on in the headlines. So I was an easy face of the enemy. So it's an issue that it isn't that I'm being a wuss about it, which I'm not saying that you are saying that to me. Yeah, I'm just letting you giving you the little background here that I'm pretty sensitive about the target thing because I almost quit the SCA back in 9/11.
It's very interesting.
Totally
So,
understandable.
yeah. Well, understandable, and yet exactly the sort of thing that inclusion is seeking to press against. And before I move on, Gorandov, did Ducky give you sufficient resource that you feel that you can move on and address that particular question? Excellent, thank you. 2 thumbs up. I'm going to move on, and don't be afraid to chuck questions into the chat. And as we've seen, Ducky is really good at stopping my flow when required, which is just what I need, because otherwise I will talk your leg off. One of the difficulties we have in doing anything in the society that is not the fun we've all turned up to do is that people are in a recreational club very often in order to enjoy themselves. Very few people have said, you know what I want to do? I want to join the Society for Creative Anachronism, not because there's fencing, not because there's arts. I want to join because I want to do administration. Now, we do have people who do a lot of administration, and we do have structures that enable that. But if we start to think about conducting leadership development, training, education programs in order to ensure that we can be as diverse as we need to be, then we always have to push back against running up against the boundaries of time and energy that people have. So that means that anything we do in order to create a structure or to lead in order to achieve these aims requires us to allocate resource, and that means to take people's time and energy away from doing what they came to do in order to achieve these goals. And we as a society are often rotten at this. As a club, we create the idea of a service track that is people who are in the club in order to facilitate others. And that's fine, but it is also a way of working which absolves other people from the requirement or from the perception of the requirement that they pitch in and help as well. And in my part of the world, our stiffest competition is live action role play. And in Northern Europe, there is a lot of live action role play that is extremely well organized, extremely well resourced. And you turn up, you pay, and you don't do any work to support the game. Paid staff do that. There are people who get some money off for participating in managing the games. But here's an interesting exception to that in the LARP world. In the big, well-organized LARPs, code of conduct, DEI, and other requirements that are required in order to enable people to interact with each other positively are managed by players very often. And one of the things I find fascinating is that because in a LARP environment, sometimes There is gameplay which involves shouting at people, being unpleasant to people, hitting people with a LARP sword or killing people with a LARP spear. There are rules around where and when you can be abusive to someone. Because for game purposes, game abuse is fine, isn't it? But in order to build a wall between game abuse and, God forbid, real abuse, there are structures designed that there are spaces where game abuse is permitted in order to ensure that if you don't want to see, hear, or smell abuse, you just stay out, you stay away from that space. It's a very sophisticated approach. And as long as we, as a competitor with LARP, are unable to be quite that well organized with how we regulate and how we create expectations around people's behavior, we're rushing to catch up to something like that.
Additionally, some of those groups also have, like if you are a player character, because I participate in some of those here in the States, they have times for pre-negotiation between your characters, so you and the other character can have boundaries and expectations conversations about what you're going to be playing ahead of time to what you're going to be doing. So even if you are in one of those areas and suddenly you don't feel comfortable doing what you said you were going to do, you can call you can use the predetermined timeout sign or whatever that you have talked about in your boundaries and expectations conversations to take yourself out of it, or say that communicate that you've changed your mind. So these groups are 100% about informed consent, which we
Yeah,
are well behind the ball on when we're coming when the SEA is coming to things like A&S competitions, codes of conduct, things like that. We're well behind the ball on informed consent.
you know, I've never thought about arts and science competitions and informed consent together. And so you've given me something really, really chunky to take away with me.
We don't provide, a lot of times we don't provide a rubric. It's up until like very recently that only people have started to provide a rubric of what you're going to be judged on. We don't tell people how people are going to talk to them, the words that are going to be used, how, like, somebody will come in and two different judges will be very different on how they approach how they talk to a person. Some people will just tear it apart, which is not the best way that somebody might receive criticism, where somebody will say a lot of positive things and never actually tell you what went wrong, uh and then we'll say later, oh, I actually told them XYZ thing, and but that's not what they parsed out because they don't have the language, then they didn't have those boundaries and expectations conversations.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Well, and it really does speak to the belonging aspect, doesn't it?
Mhm.
We have, as a club,
And as Kaylin says in the chat, on-tier many LARPs also have in-game consequences for misbehavior that are much more nuanced than the SCA, which is true. We don't have, like, as you said, we don't have like disciplinary actions or nuanced consequences. And Kaylin also brings up that on-tier now has extensive training for arts and sciences judges, and the East Kingdom, Bella brought up that the East Kingdom also has rubrics and mandatory training as well now, but those are very, very recent additions, I think, as far as you're talking about with the SEA.
Fascinating. We have language that we use which can be problematical, which can be othering. For instance, I have a personal hatred of the term the populace, because to my ear, not only is it a term which in the Middle Ages meant, you know, the all those horrible poor people, but to my modern ear, I hear something that differentiates, that splits off one segment of the membership from another. And I sometimes hear people use the populace to mean the people who aren't royals, the royals and the populace. I sometimes hear populace to refer to people who aren't peers, the peers and the populace. And this is at odds with the idea that we're all meant to be gentle or noble people. And it's also at odds with the idea that we're all members of the same club. I would rather hear us use the word the membership when we're referring to the membership of the club on the club side, the management side, and call us the court in game. But that's my personal language fantasy. I can't impose that on other people. What I do identify is that we don't have clear ideas about what we expect our members to do to help run the club and what our prerequisites for participation are. The idea that we ought to have a preparation requirement before arts competition is a fascinating one, whether for judges or whether for entrants. When I was a soldier in the British Army, every single soldier in the armed forces, soldier, sailor, and airman in the armed forces, had to have diversity and equity training once a year. And you went into a room and you had usually a prepared package to ensure that it was delivered in a uniform way across the organization, because we felt as an organization we could not expect people to display behaviors that they
Mael,
had not to
Mael
display.
has a question.
You're so good at making sure I stop talking, Ducky. I really appreciate that.
I'm a little bit
Mel-
fearless. Mael has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, actually call me Mel, and I apologize for my birds in the background. They're happy that it's morning here. Recently, I just entered my first A&S competition after playing for like 15 years. And some of that attitude that was mentioned here in Ontario is part of what held me back from that. But what I actually did is one of the judges who had never judged before, but is our A&S minister. I have judged before, even though I have never competed before, which is an odd situation. Shush, I'm talking. And so I sat her down and walked her through, because she wasn't a knitter. And so I talked her through on how they were made, how to judge them with the rubric. And we had several newcomers come up and join in. And so I basically, before the competition, held a class on how specifically to judge my items according to the rubric that we had. So that wasn't planned. That just happened.
No, but it sounds like an
So-
excellent boundaries and expectations conversation. I know I keep harping back on that like particular set of words because I just think it's a very important conversation that people should have when they're going to enter into tense conversations or potentially difficult conversations.
It is, and boundaries and expectations are both forms of structure.
Mhm.
And it sounds to me, Mel, that you were exercising leadership.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything else about that, Mel?
I also, this is kind of tangential. I'm so sorry about my birds. They hear people talking
Not a
and they want to
problem.
join in.
No, just talk about it.
Was with newcomers, because as some of you might have heard about something recently that happened here with a newcomer in Ontario. This was before that, was that I wanted to kind of set that attitude or that culture here locally for those newcomers. So that way they saw that you can have these conversations, that you can come forward with questions. It's okay to not know something, and like you said, kind of set those expectations and share knowledge. Because when I first started, there was a lot of, this is my little bubble. Nobody else is allowed inside my little bubble.
Mhm.
So I'll stop yapping.
No. I think that's really useful. When we think about the ways and means we can take the resources at our disposal and use them to achieve these goals and to exercise, to create structures and to create leadership, exactly that kind of idea is important to us. One of the things that I think is very important is that we think about how we structure the way we do this. And we've heard some really good rough and ready structures such as having conversations with people. I think structured collaboration is really important. But when I was a Principality Seneschal, I had to give some thought to how I was going to deliver goals around diversity, equity, inclusion. We didn't say belonging then, but I do like belonging. And I did not want to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer, because my feeling was if I had one, then that person would be responsible for delivering on diversity, equity, inclusion, and nobody else would be. It would signal that it was a discrete thing. Just as the marshal of fence does not have to deliver on heralding, just as the marshal in armored combat doesn't have to deliver on arts, even though there are interactions between them, even though the armor is maybe an art, even though the beginning of the fight might be shouted by a herald, even though there are interactions, it would signal that it was someone else's responsibility. So I appointed deputy seneschals so that I as seneschal could be advised and that I as seneschal could act, and so that it would be my job to deliver on diversity, equity, and inclusion, supported by people for whom it was a specialist brief. And in fact, I had separate inclusivity and diversity deputies, because a lot of the inclusivity issues I had to deal with involved accessibility, particularly disabled accessibility, whereas a lot of the ideas around diversity had a lot to do with neurodiversity and a different set of issues. So I felt it was good to have two advisors, but I wanted them to advise me so that I could execute on my responsibilities rather than hand the responsibility to someone else. I wonder whether anybody here has had similar experience trying to bring diversity and equity into the execution structures, the delivery structures, the officership within their parts of the society.
So that's how we currently have the DEIB office structured here in Caid. It is a deputy seneschal to the kingdom seneschal, and each DEI officer is a deputy seneschal to their local baronial officer. And that is how we've structured it here, more out of safety. And Runa says it's same in the mid-realm. It's more out of safety, at least in Caid, because the corporate board can come in and tell you to get rid of any officer that they want. At least in the States, the board can tell you this office does not need an officer. You don't need to have this person. This person cannot do this job. But as a seneschal, nobody can tell you who your deputies are. Only the society seneschal can tell you who your deputies are, right?
Right.
And so it was to protect that office from being taken away.
Oh, that's interesting.
That it got structured that way here in Caid. And I was a territorial seneschal and then the deputy seneschal in charge of DEIB here in my local barony for about a year or so before it became an untenable situation. That's how I'm going to phrase that.
It's very delicate.
But it has been very difficult, even just like working from trying to get things from the bottom up to try to change things. Like I've tried to work with Charles on a proposal for us working with RAIN, with the Rape and Incest National Network, to try to teach us how to respond to these, because we're seeing an increase in assaults on people in our game and things like that. So I was trying to get people to be taught on how to respond to crises, how to do trauma-informed approaches when they're responding to these, so they're not re-traumatizing people when we're investigating and doing these things in the game. And it has been difficult because of the different structural changes and just because nobody knows who's answering to who when I send it up the chain.
Yeah.
It is a mess.
Yeah, and a mess is something we don't really need in something that's complex and difficult like this. I think it's fascinating, the idea of structuring an office through a fundamentally defensive process that's seeking to defend the structure from the organization's own leadership. I think that bespeaks a complex social world we work in, doesn't it?
It really does.
One of the other things we have in our club is we have a blurring of roles between the game side and the club side. We have, for instance, our royalty are officers of our corporations or affiliates. So so in the US and Canada, royalty are officers of SCA Inc. Oddly, in Europe, royalty are officers of SCA Inc., even in areas that have separate affiliates, which will eventually result in a complex and difficult lawsuit, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, just speaking as a legal professional. Yeah.
And don't get me started on financial audit.
Oh,
So
Lord. Same.
that is not the subject of this session. So we also have leadership functions divided between the seneschal, for instance, and royalty. And we have various offices that are related to communications as we're discussing a communications function. So if I want to communicate messaging around DEIB, do I, as a leader, even a leader just within the DEIB sphere, or a leader in an office, do I have to convene the chronicler, the web officer, the social media officer, the chatelaine, in order to be talking to all of my communication channels? Well, probably yes. And yeah, and if I am seeking to address issues in the combat arts around DEIB, does that mean I need to be able to convene the armored combat marshal, marshal of fence, captain of archers, and other martial sports stroke arts people? Well, possibly yes. Who has the social credit and the power to bring those people together? I can tell you, as a former seneschal, it's not the seneschal.
It's usually the hats. They're your community buy-in. They're your community buy-in.
The community buy-in often comes from the people with the social credit, and who's got the social credit? It is the royals of one sort or another. And you said just now, Ducky, you referred to barons, and I think having baronies is great. And I wish I were in a kingdom that had more baronies, because that provides coordination and leadership functions for exactly this sort of moment. But I'm in a kingdom that's got, I think, 6 baronies. All of Finland is one barony. Most of Ireland is one barony. So I can't look at an area where there is an issue and expect a baron to sort it out unless that happens to be in a barony. So one of the things we have to address as we look to structure leadership functions is maybe being deputy to the seneschal isn't ideal. Maybe we need to find a way to wire this into royalty. Modeling behavior, interestingly, around DEI is something that royals are good at. I know that in the last 4 years, the king and queen of Drachenwald, for instance, wear a rainbow chain around their necks. And that started out with the king doing it to signal that being LGBT plus is not incompatible with being the king. And then 2 reigns later, the Queen started to wear a rainbow chain in order to make the point that our leaders, whether or not they identify as LGBT plus, wear a sign of support around their necks. That's priceless. That's worth more than 100 articles in the newsletter or 100 posts to a website.
Caitlin brings up the excellent point, though, that because baronage changes every 3 to 5 years, these policies, and royals change every 6 months, these policies end up changing as these royals change. So you could go, like her example is the politics change every 3 to 5 years. So you could go from having somebody who's very pro this to somebody who's very anti this. And so, as Raven pointed out, the trick is ensuring continuity.
Yeah, so it's easy for me to say, isn't it, that this needs to be plugged into royalty. Seneschals last longer. The offices have inertia. Crowns don't always. However, I think that 4 or 5 years in, if a new king of Drachenwald turned up and was not wearing the rainbow chain, it would be an awkward moment indeed. We are good at binding our royalty with tradition. We are good at creating tradition. Even we're good at creating bad traditions. Why not ensure that we bind our barons, princes, and crowns with good traditions as well? So the point is well taken. Sorry, who is it who gave us that point?
There was a couple of people. Caitlin was talking about how the baronial politics sway wildly, and Raven brought up the point of continuity.
Yeah, I appreciate both of those points. We also have the peer's duty to advise. And I think that's also very important. We give a lot of power, privilege, and prestige to our peers. And one of the things I often say to people when they're sitting vigil for peerages is, think about what you're going to do to deserve the power, the prestige of the peerage that you're about to get. Because an awful lot of peerages, not taking the individuals, but the peerages themselves, do not seek to collaborate to achieve useful aims for the organization. A lot of peerages are good at gatekeeping their own ranks and maintaining their prestige. And I guess that's fine, but if that's all you do, then you are an oxygen thief. What you need to do to justify the oxygen you breathe and to justify your prestige within this organization is make things happen. Peers have a duty to advise the crown. They have access to the crown that other people don't have. So maybe that's part of the answer to exercising leadership when we are in a place where every 4 to 6 months, the crowns change, and every 2 to 5 years, the barons change.
I think one of the other points was the barons didn't used to change, but now they do, which is true in some kingdoms. Raven brought up how on-tier baronial heads didn't used to have term limits. Caid had similar issues, and it wasn't until within the last 10 or 20 years where they made it so it wasn't a lifetime appointment. And they're talking, people are in the chat talking about encouraging royal peers to continue to use their renown to make these expectations of inclusion. And some of the Canadian players are talking about that these issues, these structure issues, are a significant point as to why many of them in Canada want to differentiate away from SEA Inc.
That's very interesting. There's a Facebook group around creating a Canadian affiliate, which I'm a member of, and I don't see the discussion of nearly enough. So I'm going to have to go and have a look at that.
Lexi asked a question: do we believe, or do you guys believe, that peerages should reflect a professional status for the SCA? And then also Kat has raised her hand, so we'll get to Kat after that, and then we probably have to start wrapping up because this was supposed to be just an hour session, I think. Or was it like 30 to 45 minutes? Was it, or?
we still have the room for a while, so
Oh,
I'm
okay.
happy to.
We're good. Then.
Sorry,
Okay.
so what was, so before Kat, and we will come to you, Kat, what was the question before Kat?
Lexi asked, do you guys believe that peerages should reflect a professional status for the SCA?
Lexi, can you explain what you mean by a professional status for the SCA?
Did you want to unmute, Lex, or do you want me to unmute for you? And Anna said that she's the next teacher in here at 11 a.m. So we have about 10 minutes. Let me unmute you, Lex. Hold on. Oh, you have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry, it won't let me unmute you.
While there's unmuting, I just want to say I don't want to give an inaccurate answer, especially to a question about professionalism, which I think is really important to the society, because we often allow ourselves to be less competent in our society life than we do in our daily life, and that's a problem. So Lex, I'll give you a chance to type that, and let me ask Kat for her question.
It wasn't so much a question. There was a couple of other discussions going on in the chat, and one of them was kind of comparing the fear of losing the DEIB office, the same as we did with the chirurginate and the constabulary, and those were shut down for entirely different
reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. And I was
Liability
like,
insurance
yeah,
and stuff.
I can understand this, the hey, it's the same, but it's not, it's apples and oranges. And I kind of loosely explained why that happened in chat. So hopefully I didn't derail anyone.
No, and you were right to make that point, because medical and law enforcement liability is vastly different than like employment law. And we're trying to, with DEIB, trying to be more in line with employment law, which is what we should be doing. We shouldn't actually try to have like Leos or have medical officers because we don't have the insurance for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Different animal.
Different animal entirely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's come back to Lex. What was the question there? What did we mean by professional?
Lex has observed that a lot of the leadership and influence of the game is in the peers' hands. Waiting for more responses. That's going to happen naturally in any community. Just as a side point that I've noticed from coming across from Indigenous communities, the older recognized people, we don't have peerages because we're a culture community, but the older recognized elders, so to speak, are the ones that have the leadership and influence, and you need to get that sort of community buy-in from your elders. And in this particular case, you could use a peer like an elder because they have been recognized as a knowledgeable person, as a top of their field. You know what I mean?
Come back to Lex's point, and I will wrap up because I do want to respect timings and I do want to respect the next session. Requirements, I think, for us in taking up leadership in DEI in order to achieve these aims. We have to think about how we exercise leadership. We have to develop our own leadership and help other people develop their leadership, because we can't expect people to act in ways they haven't been taught to act in, or to do things they haven't been taught how to do. We have to have ongoing discussion of the aims we are trying to achieve, because sometimes we assume that everyone is starting from the same place, and when we do that, we're always wrong. And there's an example I always cite. I saw people starting to write, I think it was a North American thing, starting to write folks with an X. And nobody could explain to me why they were spelling folks with an X. And it really started to feel like it was a trap. And that if I didn't say folks with an X, and I wasn't sure when I should or shouldn't, then I would be doing something wrong, and I didn't know why, and I hated it. So one of the things I started to say, if I saw people use it, was please explain to me why you're writing folks with an X. Explain what it means to me. Explain what your expectations on me are. Is there someone I need to refer to that way? And that changed my approach to it, because it was no longer me feeling like I was being tricked. It
All
was
right.
something that I could successfully engage
Really
with.
quick, Lex's question is, do we expect the peers to reflect professional behavior via their station?
Okay, I will come to that in a second.
Or are they allowed to play as a hobby? I can comment on the folks thing. I used the X to be more inclusive language-wise of other languages, other gender pronouns, other things that weren't outside the gender, or that were outside the gender binary. That is what I was using it for.
Right, and you weren't trying to make people feel stupid, right?
Nope.
No, I felt stupid in spite of the fact that was not what you or others were trying to do. And that speaks to educating people. It speaks to the idea that if we're going to have
it is also 11 a.m. though. But
we must prepare people for them.
Yeah.
So we need to ensure that crowns and seneschals have clear understandings of what their responsibilities are around this and what the differences are. And we have to develop processes that are fit for purpose, lawful, and transparent. And now I'm going to stop talking. I'll only answer that point from Lex. I think that expecting ethical, appropriate behavior from peers is important. If that's what we mean by professionalism, then yeah, we do have professional expectations. And if it's not fun for people to behave ethically, appropriately, and competently, then they shouldn't be accepting peerages.
All right, cool. I'm going to stop the recording.